Project management students, today we're going to be talking about the project management process groups. In other words, how we break down the actual sub-processes of project management into manageable chunks. So we're going to be talking about how this is broken out today, both from a predictive and from an agile approach. Of course, predictive is the traditional method of software development and project management. It means a very slow, deliberate process where the project itself is the focus, and agile, which is more focused on the final products that we're producing. Agile is much more popular in a lot of modern IT contexts. There's a reason, for example, why Windows ships with so many lines of bad code, why we're downloading patches for much of technology, because products and services are released oftentimes before they are actually finished and ready for prime time. So what are our objectives? Our objectives are to be able to talk through the project management groups and what activities go with each. We're going to talk about how these tie back to the specific project management areas that we talked about in previous chapters. Particularly, we'll give this an IT context, but keep in mind in this class, these principles are applicable to any kind of project management. And we're also, guys, not so much talking about it in depth in this recording, but I would also encourage you to read through and apply the case study that is used throughout our text to apply how all these project management areas actually work in application. And again, when we look at the project that's outlined in the text from both an agile and a predictive approach, agile again being the more kind of iterative approach, and predictive being a more deliberate project-minded approach, you'll see that the ways in which projects are managed can be very, very much different. We'll also talk about some templates you can use to help you out with these processes as well. So to start off, we've got several knowledge areas that play into project management. And as you've seen illustrated in your text, we've got a number of them between integration, scope, schedule, cost, quality, resource, communications, risk, procurement, stakeholder management. These are all knowledge areas that you will need to apply throughout the life of a project, and they'll neatly fit into what we refer to as project management groups. And some of these project management areas will apply in specific groups. We'll see how these break out. Let me give you an example. If you are managing stakeholders, you're going to be managing stakeholders in every process group, whether or not you are starting a project, initiating a project that is, planning a project, making the project actually happen, and so on and so forth. So the project management knowledge areas go into the management groups as well. So what is a process? And again, defined by our text, a process is a series of actions directed toward a particular result. If we look at project management as a whole, we've got a number of processes that are going on at the same time. And again, these processes are broken down in the following groups. You've got to start a project, you've got to plan how to carry off a project, you've got to actually execute the project, you got to make sure that your project is proceeding as planned, which means you're monitoring and controlling, and finally at the end of a project you got to close it out. You got to go through whatever procedures are necessary to draw that project to a close. So interestingly enough, and the more time you spend in the planning phase of a project, the less expenses you're going to incur, generally speaking, in the executing phase. So the best project managers do spend more time and more resources in the planning phase of a project. That's not to say that executing isn't the largest area. It is. No matter what methodology you're using, generally speaking, the executing phase will be the most expensive and time-consuming part of any project, but the more time you spend in planning, the better you can manage your expenses when you're executing. It just makes sense. The more time you put into creating a well-managed project, the better it'll turn out when you actually begin to execute. So, plenty of things go wrong, and we talk a lot about how things go wrong in project management. Failing to properly plan, failing to think about how all these sections of a project fit together can often result in failure in the long run. So when we're talking about looking at the project management, knowledge areas and processes, they all cross over and work together. What this means, guys, is we need to look at a project management plan as something that has multiple pieces that cross over with each other. When we fail to look at all these areas together as one big project management plan as a series of groups that fit together, sometimes our projects don't turn out as well as we wish they would. So the process groups themselves are mapped to the knowledge areas based on the PMI standard. And again, our PMI standard, the PMBOK guide, is the guide for our text. Table 3.1 in our text gives a nice illustration of this. And for your convenience, we're going to talk through Table 3.1 in the next slide. So from our text, we can see on Table 3.1, which is spread out over a couple of pages here, our knowledge area crosses over with different project management process groups. For example, if you're doing project integration management, this is one example. In our initiating group, we've got to develop a project charter. In our planning process groups, we've got to develop the actual project management plan. When we're executing, actually making the project happen, we've got to actually direct the project work. We're monitoring, controlling, we're making sure the work is being done as required. And finally, in the closing area, we close project or phase. Now, not all the knowledge areas have the same process management groups involved with them. So for example, project scope management is not an initiating process, but it's a part of the planning process. And project scope management isn't also part of the executing phase. What this means is when we're deciding how big a project is, if we're going for the project scope, that's not part of the initial discussion. It is, however, part of the planning discussion. It's not something we really deal with while we're executing, but while we're monitoring, we're seeing if things are getting beyond scope. So you can see that not all knowledge areas cross over with all project management process groups. And again, project scope management means we're managing how large the project is. Project schedule. Are we staying on schedule or not when we are performing project work? Cost management. For example, we've got we're taking part in the planning part of the process of project management and also monitoring, controlling. Project quality management. Again, not so much in the initiation phase, but it takes place in planning, executing, and monitoring and controlling. We get to project resource management. Again, because we haven't named resources when we're initiating the project, it's not part of the initial part of the project. Some of these do cross over more areas than others, so I won't read through the rest of them because our text does a pretty good job, and we, in each chapter, are going to be covering one of these knowledge areas and what groups they cover. But the important part to take away from the slide is that certain knowledge areas cross over certain project management groups. So in terms of how we develop an IT project methodology or a project methodology, companies have their own ways of doing things. Some have more formal and less formal methods of project management, as we mentioned. Now, our text describes a number of project management methodologies, including PRINCE, Agile, Rational Unified Process, Six Sigma. These are all different project management methodologies. They all adhere, however, to the PMI standard, the Project Management Institute standards for good project management. For example, if you're doing something like Agile, and again, this is a very cursory look at project management, Agile would imply that we're moving very quickly, as opposed to a more traditional process such as Six Sigma, for example. So when we talk about waterfall methodologies, for example, we're talking about predictive project methodologies as opposed to agile methodologies, which are more product than project related. So the bottom line, and I enjoy throwing in a lot of these stats, but what it really comes down to is that a lot of companies say they are engaging in agile project management or rapid life cycle development, but in reality, their teams aren't really keeping up with what the managers like to say. It's cool to say we're agile. It's cool to say that we are using iterative processes and that we're using more product-oriented than project-oriented methodologies. But it comes right down to the fact that a lot of companies are saying they're doing it, but the rank and file certainly don't seem to be feeling the same way about it. And again, what it really comes down to is that companies that are good at project management tend to produce more successful projects. Those who are sort of winging it or do not have mature methodologies for managing projects don't tend to pull off projects as successfully. It sounds very straightforward. More companies, again, want to get into project management methodologies and really leveraging the knowledge areas in the project management process groups. But in reality, as we saw in the previous slide, more companies believe they are doing sound project management that probably are actually doing sound project management. The purpose of this slide is to remind you to take a look at the case study. The case study within this chapter actually gives us a pretty good idea of a traditional waterfall or predictive methodology of project management to carry out initiating, planning, executing, and controlling phases of a project. And later on in the chapter, we'll also use a more agile approach to show you ways in which that process can be less predictive and more agile. I encourage you as we go through this to look at those case studies, because we will be applying the project management principles in action by studying those cases. So let's talk about what pre-initiation and initiation means. Guys, the old expression, the old cliche is look before you leap. Guys, there are reasons to think about whether or not we should get into a project in the first place. Things to think about. Does the project fit with your organization's strategic goals? For example, St. Francis, our mission and goals are to provide education to better the minds of students at our university, to make our world a better place. If we had the idea of getting involved in a business project, for example, that would produce a tobacco farm, that would run counter to the principles of the university, which has a no smoking policy. So that project would die from the get-go simply because it doesn't fit within our mission or values. Things that would run counter to the things we hold important. It's the same concept if you're getting into IT projects. Does this project fit within your organization? If you're a software development company, for example, does developing a new hardware-based phone system make any sense with your strategic plan or the reason your company exists? If not, you may have a non-starter to get from the get-go. So we always have to look back at what our organizations are about before we decide to greenlight a project. So what are some of the tasks that we take on before we initiate a project? Bluntly stated, you need to think about whether or not this actually fits within your company at the 30,000-foot view. Meaning, if we look at this project from the get-go, if our company has $1 million in revenues a year, can we possibly take on a project that costs $500,000? Does it actually fit within the amount of cost we can bear? What about the time frame? If we're in a company that typically does short-term projects, do we have the resources and the wherewithal to do a multiple-year project? So is the scope and time correct for us? For example, is a project too large? If we're a small contractor, can we possibly take on a project the size of that which they want us to take on? There are examples of when companies have taken on projects that were too large for them. One of the great examples from recent history, when there was the aftermath of the hurricane in Puerto Rico, an electrical company from the Midwest got the contract to restore power to the entire country and lacked the resources to really be able to pull off the project. In addition, before you start a project, it's a good idea to know who your sponsor is. If you don't have somebody within your organization who can actually steward the project, actually get it through, you've got little chances of succeeding. And this is one of these scenarios where that person won't necessarily be leading the project, but they will be the backing for that project. If you don't have backing in your administration, you may fail from the get-go. We'll be talking more about some of this stuff in stakeholder management as well. What about the project manager? Do you have somebody who has the freedom in their schedule to take on this project and the skills to be able to manage all the skill sets that are going to be required to be able to pull this project off? Somebody who is a good people person, at the same time a good analytical thinker. What's your business case for the project? How are you going to pay for it? In other words, are you paying for these out of R&D funds? Is that how you're developing this new piece of software? Are you paying for it based on anticipated revenue? What is your business case? The project manager, him or herself, do they understand what your expectations are of them? If you are greenlighting a new project, does this individual or individuals understand if this project is right for them, if they can believe that they can pull it off? And finally, is the project, if it's a really large scope project, is there a chance that maybe it would be logical to break this into more than one project? Something else to consider. So in terms of initiating, the knowledge area, project integration management, again, going back to previous chapters, how everything ties together. The first part of this project process is going to be to develop what we refer to as a charter. A charter is kind of like a mission statement for what the project is all about. So the other initiating process here would be a project charter assumption log. In other words, we're making assumptions about what the project is meant to achieve. In terms of project stakeholder management, you want to identify the people who are going to be affected by this project. So who are your stakeholders? And you also might want to create some documents such as a stakeholder register, which is a list of all the people who are possibly affected, a process for change requests, a process for plan updates and how you're going to communicate them, and how you're going to update your actual project documentation. Again, stakeholder management is one of the quote-unquote soft areas, but it's very important. Here's one of the reasons it's important, guys. In 2019 and beyond, right now we have 5, count them, 5 generations in the workplace. All these generations communicate in different ways. They enjoy communicating, some via text, some in person, some want meetings. You've got to be able to satisfy the expectations of the stakeholders, particularly if they are people who are in control of resources that you might need. So let's give you an example. This is a stakeholder register. And if you look at this register, we've got the name of the individuals who are on our team, for example. We've got what their rank is. Why is that important? Well, if Joe's our CEO and we've got somebody down at the bottom, Louise, who is a PR director, they're going to have different interests and expectations. If we're developing a new product or service, for example, PR may want to market the heck out of it. They may want to be all over. Joe Fleming, however, may want to have all the information before it leaves the building. We can list whether or not these are internal or external stakeholders. Why does that matter? Well, we may be sharing different levels of sensitive information with individuals who are within our organization as opposed to outside the organization. The role of these individuals is also important. What do these folks do within the project? Here we have Erica Bell, who is our project manager, and that person is going to be responsible for a lot, so they're probably going to be getting almost all the communications. And finally, what's their contact information? Here we have all emails listed, but there may be times when it makes sense just to put phone numbers in, for example, because some people may prefer calls or texts. So again, we get into our stakeholder management strategy. We'll be talking a lot more about this in stakeholder management. We get to that later in the semester. But this is something that I would classify as a sensitive internal document. If you are keeping records for yourself, you'd want to know, for example, do these folks have interest in your project? Do they support it? Do they have a high or low interest level? What are your ways to keep these folks engaged? This is part of the PMI standard. This is part of that approach. I won't say that everybody does it or writes it down. This is the part of project management that comes down to having good soft skills, knowing how to learn people, and think about who you're managing exactly. Like, let's look at Joe, for example, our CEO. He likes to stay on top of key projects, and he's very money motivated. So he is all about short face-to-face meetings. He doesn't want to read a lot of email. And we also have Louise here, who might be thinking about leaving the company. The rumor is that she's on her way out, and if she's a valued employee, we might want to emphasize how this project could help her look better for future career prospects as well. So when we draft the project charter, and that's going to be something that I really want you to take some time looking at in the text. Again, your charter, just like we have charters when we form countries or clubs, it really is setting a list of expectations for what we as the project team believe this project to be. And it's great if you're able to conceive a project charter which has consensus as well, if people around the table have all bought into a particular concept. I really do believe that a kickoff meeting, an in-person meeting, or at the least a real-time meeting, something over video conference or conference call, gives an opportunity for people to set their expectations in person, to get to know each other a little bit, and even in 2019 and beyond, when we are looking at a technologically based society where we communicate more with text than we do face-to-face, there is value in personal interaction, particularly with people you're going to be working very tightly with. So I think that it makes a lot of sense to have a project kickoff meeting. Here's an example for how to make good use of time at a kickoff meeting. I know this is not a class about managerial communications, something I'm very passionate about. People generally hate meetings. And the way to make people hate meetings less is make them meaningful. Show them that you're not wasting their time when they're coming to the meeting. Accomplish something. And we accomplish something by making task lists, follow-ups, and making people responsible. In other words, if we just have a meeting to talk and nobody is assigned specific tasks, the likelihood of them getting done is very low. We're making people accountable and showing that we're taking action. So make good use of that kickoff meeting and turn it into something useful. So that gets us into the idea of project planning. So the main reason we plan projects is so we create roadmaps. You're creating a roadmap for your entire project, and it's including all of the knowledge areas that we talked about. So table 3.7 in our text is a great example. But if we look at the key outputs that are included in our case study, for example, we've got a contract for our team, we've got a statement of the scope, how big it's going to be, work breakdown structures, which are graphical representation of how tasks produce deliverables. We'll talk about those in a bit. If you've never heard of a Gantt chart, that's okay, because you're going to be creating one in this class, and that means we're showing how different tasks and individuals are related and how one relies on another. And we also produce what we refer to as a risk register, which shows what are our risks. As we're taking on this project, where can we fail? How can we mitigate this risk? And there's a number of sample documents in our text that really guide these perspectives very well. But when we create a plan, the main thing to remember is we're creating a roadmap for the entire project. Here's an example of a typical Gantt chart. Now, we'll be looking at these later on, but you can see, for example, we've got all the major project processes listed here, whether you're initiating, planning, etc. All the individual deliverables and tasks underneath them, and we can see these bars show us dependencies. And again, don't worry about this too much immediately, because we're going to be covering this in later discussions. But a Gantt chart is a graphical representation of how the work actually gets done. And here we have a risk register where we've prioritized what could be the top items, the top risks that could derail our process. For example, we've got lack of input from internal consultants as our number one risk on the case study project from our text, where at a lower risk is realizing the benefits of the new system within 1 year. We've got short-term to long-term, apparently, by the way these folks have broken down the risk register. But a risk register basically is saying these are the items we know could cause problems for us. Why do we create a risk register? So we can look out for these problems and hopefully head them off before we walk into them. So a risk register is very useful as well, and it's something to consider when you're starting a new project. Execution typically is the largest part of any project. It makes sense. You spent the time planning, you're executing and actually doing the work. Now here's the thing, as the old expression goes, the more time you spend planning, generally speaking, the better the execution goes when you get there, because you've taken the time to think about what some of your potential variables could be. In terms of execution, if you see table 3.11 in our text, we've got a number of areas that show us how you actually execute, what are the knowledge areas associated. But what it really comes down to is when we go through execution at each phase of a project, most managers and customers are most concerned about the deliverables. In other words, when we're executing, what are we producing in each phase of the project? If we are executing the project at each level, what are the outputs? So it's important that as we're going through a project, for example, that we're documenting our requests for change. Why is that important? Well, change typically adds cost and complexity, so we want to keep track of that stuff. And keeping track of milestones is also important, so that we are able to make sure that we have a record of where we are. How many, can you knock off the lists and to-do items that you were working toward? Those are our milestones. So our text gives us a really great example. For example, we've got our milestone listed up here and what date that it was due. Did we complete it or not? Who did it? Were there issues involved? And we even have, for example, our project management process group. We've got initiating areas, we've got executing, we've got monitoring and controlling. Now, you may see all this stuff and say, wow, there's a lot of crossover and a lot of back and forth. Well, you're absolutely right, there is. For example, to be able to monitor and control work, we're actually monitoring what is happening with the project. At the same time, we're executing. All these processes can be happening at the same time, and from a planning standpoint, there's a lot of crossover. So if we look at the project soup to nuts, the due dates that are listed here are what we hope to hit. If we're looking at the issues and moving toward those, we might know, for example, what's happening in the executing part of this project. Even though planning is still going on, the executing part of the project, we've got a poor response so far. That's according to our responsible party. So it's a good way for example, on these milestone reports to be able to keep track of where we're going and what we have yet to do. So yes, all of these project management process groups are not always necessarily linear, and we can go back and forth between them. And when you're doing project integration management, you're thinking about all of these things at the same time. Keep reading, it'll make sense. So what's a best practice? A best practice is to look at how other groups have run projects and done well. If you, for example, if you want to know about a well-run project, look no further than companies like Boeing. Look no further than companies like Lockheed Martin. Although there's been some quote-unquote fraud, waste, and abuse in some of their bigger government projects, the very fact that we've been able to accomplish things such as space flight and getting man to the moon show well-run companies. Being able to redesign automobiles. German companies like BMW and Porsche, for example, redesign their cars frequently, and they use very disciplined processes to do so. Our text gives us a lot of great examples as well. So the monitoring and controlling function of this work basically means we're making sure that what we said we were going to do, we are doing. Are we hitting a specific quality standard? For example, when we are producing this product, are there the same amount of lines of bad code we were predicting, or are there more? Is the product living up to expectations? Here we can see some great examples of how the knowledge areas integrate with the monitoring and controlling process. For example, in project integration management, the monitoring and controlling process inherently is that we're monitoring and controlling project work. Well, that makes sense. You're doing the work of integrating the entire project and coordinating what everybody else is doing. Some of the processes involved, for example, performing integrated change control is also part of that. If we look at the outputs, it tells us what our outputs are for each knowledge area and each process. So again, we've got the knowledge areas that apply to all project management. Monitoring and controlling is one of the project management process groups. So we've got these two things crossing over, and they're producing very specific outputs in each phase. So if we get over to, for example, something we'll be talking about later, project communications management, the monitoring and controlling processes, we're monitoring what people are saying, and the outputs are communications information. Are we sending out updates? Are we sending out work performance information? And again, here's the way to think about it. All the areas of knowledge that go into creating a project, how we are monitoring and controlling those areas, and as they apply to the project, produce very specific outputs. So in other words, the knowledge area is how to tie everything together. Monitoring and controlling is making sure what we said we would do or need to do gets done. And the outputs are some level of verification that it got done. It also comes down, at some point, you've got to close the project as well. And how do you close a project? Well, you would also want to make sure that you would actually accomplish and satisfy the need. Are the customer or the stakeholders willing to sign off and say, yes, you accomplished the task, or no, you did not? The outputs could be, in addition to project closure documents, you may want to have some sort of lessons learned. What did we do right? What did we do wrong? What should we change if we do this again? You're contributing to your organization's overall knowledge base, and you might even include a final report and presentation on this as well to be able to say, hey, look, this is what we learned. Why lose that valuable information that you spent so much time creating? All right, we talked a little bit earlier about what the difference is between agile and predictive project management approaches. When it comes right down to it, agile is an approach that knows that we're going to be doing a little bit of throwing stuff against the wall and seeing what sticks. It means we're also going to have multiple versions. For example, there's a reason why we have different versions of Windows. When we go from Windows 7 to Windows 8 to Windows 10, the different versions of the software, they have never perfected it yet because they keep on making revisions. That is a very modern approach to technology project management. The old predictive/waterfall model of software or technology development, although the most perfect model because we can really account for more variables and really do more fundamental processes and quality control, does not work in our modern environment time-wise sometimes. That being said, you don't make a snap decision on which model you're going to use. Some software companies, for example, companies working in industries that have very high risks of failure. In other words, if you're making software for nuclear weapons. You may take the older style of operating, the older style of project management, because there is zero room for error, as opposed to Windows, when, yeah, sometimes you're going to get system updates when you least expect them or want them. So there are reasons why we make that choice. And I think it's great that our book actually puts JWD's project into both approaches for your review. So Scrum as an agile methodology brings in some unique terminology. For example, the person who really is filling the role of the traditional project sponsor and putting some order together is called the product owner. Again, it's kind of a hybrid of the project sponsor and the person we would refer to as the project manager, who's working is kind of in tandem with the Scrum Master. This is the person who basically makes sure everybody's getting together on a daily basis, that the meetings are happening, if things are getting in the way. This person is more like a facilitator than a manager per se. And then when we say the Scrum team, we're talking about what we refer to as a small team that's working very quickly and very rapidly. Instead of a lot of planning that's going on in vacuums, people are working together more collaboratively. Very 21st century approach to project management, very appealing to both software developers and younger individuals who've grown up in the era with things like teamwork, for example. So again, these are some of the little differences. Well, an artifact, the term artifact in Scrum means basically you have something of value. So it could be a report, it could be an actual deliverable, it could be any of these things. The main Scrum artifacts are referred to in three different areas. We've got the product backlog, the sprint backlog, and the burn down chart. So the product backlog means what do we need to get done? What are the features we need to accomplish for this product? And the sprint backlog prioritizes what we've got to get done within a sprint. A sprint can be a several-day rush of activity. The burn down chart is kind of like a check-off sheet to show what you have not accomplished yet. So again, as opposed to traditional project management, which treats the project itself as the area of emphasis, the product or the object you're developing, the deliverables, are actually the goals of Scrum as opposed to the project itself, if that makes sense. So what are some of the actual roles and ceremonies when we get into Scrum? It goes a little different than traditional project management. We're talking about things like project charters and really some significant meeting and paperwork to get things started. A sprint planning session really means that you are getting with the team who is going to be doing the work to decide what work you're actually going to be doing. So that's a sprint planning session. That gets broken down further to a daily Scrum. And that just means that you have a meeting that goes no longer than 15 minutes to get everything together for the day or for the Scrum of the week, but you meet daily, no longer than 15 minutes. Sometimes these are online meetings. They're always very direct, and they're very time sensitive. Then we get into sprint reviews, and that means that we go back to the product owner. And again, the product owner is kind of a hybrid of a sponsor and a project manager to tell that individual what's been accomplished. Then finally, we get down to what we refer to as sprint retrospectives. And it's basically sort of the lessons learned. We have a similar concept when we talk about the idea of closing projects and lessons learned and updating our team information in traditional project management. In this regard, it's more of a retrospective, and it's done more frequently. So the key is more frequent direct feedback during Scrum types of project methodologies than traditional project management. So this is a good illustration of how all of these components fit together. In terms of the product backlog, those are the things we need to get done. The sprint backlog are what we're going to take on right now. The daily meetings that we have, again, during the actual Scrum itself, we're meeting 15 minutes a day, no longer than. And then when we get to the end of the sprint, we hopefully have something that we can actually evaluate, maybe a version of software or a component that we've been working on. And again, if we look at how these phases fit together, the planning, executing, closing, and monitoring, controlling phases, all traditional project management areas, are also included in Scrum as well. So in terms of the Scrum roles, artifacts, and ceremonies, and how these fit into traditional project groups. In the initiating phase, if you're doing Scrum, You're going to determine who's doing what and how many sprints it's going to take to deliver a particular product or service. During the planning part of a Scrum, you're going to create all the items we just talked about, as well as what we refer to as a release backlog. That means what we've actually accomplished. We're going to plan the work in each Scrum through our daily planning meetings, and if we are hitting stumbling blocks, or other kinds of barriers, that's what we're going to actually know to put into our lessons learned eventually. Then we execute. And that means every day during a sprint, we're actually doing project work. And again, keep in mind, this is very collaborative, done over smaller groups. And we hopefully, by the end of a Scrum, have a product we can actually ship, something we can say that we actually accomplished. It's important to realize, too, in Scrum that there's a little bit of a difference in terms of initiation and pre-initiation, in this case, between this and traditional project management. For example, in pre-initiation, whenever you are in a Scrum scenario, because it's agile type of approach to project management, you are more or less going to determine what elements you want outcomes to have in each part of a software release or a small project, and how many sprints it would take. So basically, guys, instead of looking as a whole project in terms of initiating an entire project in Scrum, you're really initiating each particular sprint or Scrum instead of looking at it project-wise. That's why it's really referred to as agile, because you're looking at it in smaller self-contained chunks than an entire large projects. I hope that makes sense. The text does a nice job of also explaining that as well. So in terms of planning, we really expect it in Scrum types of project management that the teams themselves are going to be more independent, and that the Scrum Master, again, it's kind of a hybrid of the project manager and even a team member at times, that they are actually self-directed, meaning that we're not going to have an individual charter like we would in traditional project management. The descriptions of what work needs done are going to be handled in the actual documentation we're using, meaning people can jump right in. In terms of the technical stories, we're also going to have lots of detail in there to make sure that what we're trying to accomplish in these kinds of areas is easily detailed. And every time when we talk about having a velocity or capacity for each sprint, that means how fast something is going to get done, how much energy, time, and resources do we have to get it done. Here's an example. If we look at a Gantt chart, for example, coming out of a Scrum type project approach, we've got most of these projects are going on at the same time. I shouldn't say project, most of these tasks are going on simultaneously. Meaning, for example, that we're doing the sprint backlog and the daily Scrum at the same time that we're also executing a product. So things are happening more concurrently. Although concurrent work can happen in traditional project management, it's an inherent part of how Scrum is set up. So, in addition, we can see here that we've got a product and a sprint backlog. The product backlog are all the things that we need to get done in a Scrum scenario, and the sprint backlog is what we are going to take on as part of this sprint. Now, a part of this too, when we look and we see story templates, or user stories rather, user stories mainly are the ways that users are putting their requirements or expectations into common speak, so we can turn those into technology requirements. As we walk through this, you can see that we've got more in the product backlog than we could possibly accomplish in one sprint. So it just goes to show that we have to monitor where we're going in a particular sprint as part of the Scrum methodology. And again, tracking this stuff is still part of monitoring and controlling, like it would be in a normal project management scenario. So in terms of executing, no matter what approach you're using, if it's traditional or agile, executing is still the most expensive and intense part of project management. Again, to reiterate, well-managed projects are ones that spend more time in development before execution in terms of planning, but planning is still the most expensive part and extensive. In an agile approach, though, we might do several versions of a product or service whenever we are in the process of executing. So in traditional linear project management, we like to think that we've got one walk through the execution, we come out the other end with deliverables and end the project. Where in the agile process, it goes over and over again. It's very cyclical. And in terms of communications, again, to go back to the Scrum methodology, as opposed to a traditional project management plan, with lots of traditional meetings and ways in which individuals want to be contacted in different ways. In Scrum, the project team is meeting briefly every morning, or at least virtually. So in terms of monitoring and controlling, if we're using Scrum, we talked about the daily Scrum, which means we're getting together every day to at least talk for 15 minutes or so. A review means that we might actually be doing a larger and more graphical representation. And we could even use something called a burn down chart, which shows graphically how we're making progress on the project. Here's a great example of a burn down chart in terms of the percentage of work that's been done. And these could be more detailed and broken down into work breakdown structures and everything else, as we will talk about in the coming chapters. So when it comes time to close a project in Scrum methodology, the person who we refer to as the Scrum Master is the person who also kind of recaps how the sprint went, and the team gets to interact as well to say what happened, what went well, how do we do, and the purposes are the same as traditional project management. However, to improve the process and make sure the next time we take this on, that the process is smoother and more refined. Just like in traditional project management, how you would roll all that content into some sort of organizational knowledge base, for example. There are a number of templates you can use for a lot of these areas, whether you are doing Scrum or traditional project management. Our text provides a really nice list of potential templates which you can download from our publisher as well. Whether you're building business cases or whether you're doing change requests, all the related forms that go along with a lot of the concepts we're going to be talking about. Again, this is a lot to think about right now, but these templates help organize our different process groups and knowledge areas. So what's some advice? If you are in an organization, default to whatever their templates are. They may have a particular method of tracking cost. They may have information that you need to post prior to starting a project. The bottom line is follow your organization's requirements. If your organization doesn't have good templates or good potential ways of mapping projects, then you might need to download or create your own. So in closing, the 5 project management process groups are illustrated here for you. They take you from the beginning to the end of a project, meaning that we're getting started by initiating, we're planning how the project is going to run. If we're a well-run company, we're spending more time in the planning phase than not so well-run companies. We're actually doing the work of the project, which is executing. Then we're monitoring and controlling. We're making sure our project work gets done correctly and adheres to standards. And finally, at the end, we are closing the project and learning from it. We can take all of these activities and map them to the 10 knowledge areas as defined by the Project Management Institute. Now, some folks also, when I say some folks, I mean organizations, have their own project management methodologies, including Scrum. We spent a good time talking about Scrum in this chapter. Don't get the impression that's the only type of Agile methodology that's out there, but Agile is really intended to show that sometimes projects inherently are more iterative, meaning we're doing rapid development and not necessarily beholden to a linear, predictive, waterfall type approach to project management. Thanks so much for your time and attention. I hope you enjoyed this lecture.